March 5, 1953. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades, dies in his dacha near Moscow after suffering a massive stroke. He had survived the bloodiest war in human history, orchestrated the deaths of millions through purges and forced collectivization, and transformed the USSR into a global superpower. But when he died, he left behind something unexpected: a fractured family, children scarred by his paranoia, and descendants who would make radically different choices about how to carry his toxic legacy forward. This isn't a story about Stalin the dictator. This is the story of his children. Yakov, who died in a Nazi prison camp after his father refused to save him; Vasily, who drowned in alcoholism and delusion; and Svetlana, who shocked the world by defecting to the United States and publicly denouncing her father. It's about grandchildren who changed their names, children who were sent to gulags, and descendants who are alive today, still grappling with what it means to be Stalin's blood. What happened to Stalin's family after World War II reveals profound truths about inherited guilt, the cost of totalitarian power, and whether redemption is possible for those born into evil they didn't create. Unlike Hitler's relatives, who tried to disappear, or the families of Nazi leaders who denied their crimes, Stalin's descendants faced a unique burden. They were trapped inside the very system their father built, unable to flee, unable to speak freely, and forced to watch as the dictator's paranoia destroyed them from within. The family before the fall, who were Stalin's children. To understand what happened after Stalin's death, we need to understand who these people were while he still lived. Joseph Stalin married twice and had 3 children who survived to adulthood, though his relationships with them were marked by cruelty, neglect, and in one case, deliberate abandonment that led to death. Yakov Dugashvili, born November 18, 1907, was Stalin's eldest son from his first marriage to Kato Svanadze, who died of typhus when Yakov was just 8 months old. Raised largely by relatives in Georgia while Stalin pursued revolution, Yakov grew up barely knowing his father. When they finally reunited in Moscow in the 1920s, Stalin treated him with open contempt. Yakov was sensitive, artistic, and completely unlike the hard man Stalin wanted as a son. According to multiple accounts, when Yakov's first marriage failed, he attempted suicide by shooting himself. He survived, and Stalin's reported response was chilling: "He can't even shoot straight." Vasily Stalin, born March 24, 1921, was Stalin's second son, this time with his second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. Unlike Yakov, Vasily grew up in the Kremlin, surrounded by privilege and terror in equal measure. He joined the Soviet Air Force and rose rapidly through the ranks, not because of skill, but because no one dared deny Stalin's son anything. By his 20s, Vasily was an arrogant, alcoholic officer who crashed planes, abused subordinates, and lived as if consequences didn't exist. And for a while, they didn't. Stalin protected him, covered up his failures, and enabled his worst behaviors, creating a monster of entitlement. Svetlana Alliluyeva, born February 28, 1926, was Stalin's only daughter and, for a time, the only person he seemed capable of loving. Her mother, Nadezhda, committed suicide on November 9, 1932, when Svetlana was just 6 years old, shooting herself after a bitter argument with Stalin. The official story was illness, but Svetlana would eventually learn the truth. Despite this tragedy, young Svetlana was the little sparrow of the Kremlin, doted on by her father in ways his sons never experienced. But this affection was possessive and controlling. When she fell in love at 16, Stalin had her boyfriend arrested and sent to a labor camp for 10 years. These were the 3 children who survived Stalin's rule. But there was a 4th child, one that most histories barely mention: the lost son, Yakov's tragedy in World War II. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Yakov Dugashvili was serving as an artillery officer in the Red Army. Within weeks, during the chaotic early battles, Yakov was captured by German forces. The Nazis quickly realized who they had: the son of Joseph Stalin himself. Hitler's propaganda machine immediately went to work. They printed leaflets showing Yakov in captivity and dropped them over Soviet lines, trying to demoralize troops by showing that even Stalin's own son had been captured. The Germans then made Stalin an offer. They would exchange Yakov for Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who had surrendered at Stalingrad. Stalin's response has become one of the most chilling examples of his inhumanity. "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Other versions report him saying, "I have no son named Yakov." Stalin publicly declared that any Soviet soldier who allowed himself to be captured was a traitor. Under that logic, his own son was a traitor too. But here's what makes this even more tragic. Yakov wasn't living comfortably in captivity. He was moved between several POW camps, including the notorious Sachsenhausen concentration camp. On April 14, 1943, according to German records, Yakov Djugashvili walked toward the electrified fence at Sachsenhausen and was shot dead by a guard. The official German report claimed he committed suicide by deliberately approaching the fence. Some Soviet historians later suggested he was murdered as no longer useful for propaganda. Either way, Stalin's eldest son died in a Nazi camp while his father refused to even acknowledge his existence. When told of Yakov's death, Stalin reportedly showed no emotion. His son had become another casualty of war, one Stalin could have prevented, but chose not to. Yakov left behind a wife, Yulia, and a daughter, Gulia, born in 1938. What happened to them reveals the full cruelty of Stalin's system. Yulia was arrested and sent to a labor camp for being the wife of a traitor. Never mind that her husband was Stalin's own son. In the camp, Yulia was arrested. She spent years in the Gulag system, simply for her marriage. Little Gulia was raised by relatives, growing up barely knowing her father and learning only later the full tragedy of his fate. Vasily, the son who had everything and lost it all. While Yakov died, abandoned in a Nazi camp, his half-brother, Vasily, was living a completely different reality. By 1945, as World War II ended, Vasily Stalin had achieved the rank of lieutenant general in the Soviet Air Force at just 24 years old, a promotion so absurdly rapid that it could only be explained by his surname. Vasily commanded air divisions. Despite being a mediocre pilot and terrible leader, he drank heavily, threw lavish parties, crashed planes, and faced no consequences. He married and divorced multiple times, fathered children he barely knew, and lived in luxury while ordinary Soviets starved. Protected by his father's power, Vasily became everything Stalin claimed to despise about the old aristocracy: entitled, wasteful, and useless. But everything changed on March 5, 1953, when Stalin died. Within months, Vasily's protection evaporated. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev had no love for Stalin's spoiled son. Vasily was stripped of his rank, expelled from the military, and in April 1953, arrested on charges of anti-Soviet agitation and embezzlement. The son, who had lived untouchable for decades, was suddenly just another prisoner in the system his father built. Vasily spent the next 7 years in prison, an internal exile, moving between various detention facilities. His health, already destroyed by alcoholism, deteriorated rapidly. He was released in 1960, but forbidden to live in Moscow or use the Stalin name. He changed his last name to Djugashvili, his father's original Georgian surname, trying to escape the weight of Stalin's legacy. It didn't work. Vasily continued drinking, moved to Kazan, and lived in obscurity. On March 19, 1962, at just 40 years old, Vasily Stalin died of alcoholism-related causes in a Kazan hospital. He left behind at least 4 children from multiple marriages, children who grew up bearing the Stalin name but receiving none of its former privileges. His death was barely reported. The son, who once commanded air forces and lived in palaces, died alone in a provincial city, destroyed by the very system that had once protected him. Stalin had built a machine that consumed millions, and eventually it consumed his own son too. Svetlana, the daughter who defected. If Vasily's story is about downfall, Svetlana's story is about escape, and it's one of the most dramatic Cold War defections in history. When Stalin died in 1953, Svetlana was 27 years old, twice divorced, and the mother of 2 children. She had spent her entire life under her father's control, her romantic relationships monitored and crushed, her freedom an illusion. But Stalin's death, while traumatic, also meant liberation. In the years after 1953, Svetlana began to learn the truth about her father. She discovered the full extent of the purges, the millions dead, the gulags, a terror. She learned that her mother hadn't died of illness, but had killed herself. She learned that her father had ordered the deaths of her relatives, including her uncle and aunt. The man she had loved as Papa was a mass murderer. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Svetlana worked as a translator and writer, living a relatively quiet life in Moscow. She married a 3rd time to an Indian communist named Brajesh Singh, but he died in 1966. It was his death that changed everything. In March 1967, Svetlana was permitted to travel to India to scatter Singh's ashes. While there, she walked into the US Embassy in New Delhi and requested political asylum. On April 21, 1967, the CIA smuggled her to Rome and then to the United States. Svetlana Aliyeva, Stalin's own daughter, had chosen freedom over the Soviet Union. At a press conference in New York, she publicly denounced her father and the Soviet system. She said, "I have come here to seek the self-expression that has been denied me for so long in Russia." She called her father's regime a nightmare and says she could no longer live in a country built on his crimes. The Soviet government was humiliated. They declared Svetlana a traitor and stripped her of Soviet citizenship. Her 2 children from earlier marriages, Joseph and Yekaterina, remained in the USSR, essentially held hostage. Svetlana wouldn't see them again for nearly 2 decades. But here's what no one expected. Life in America wasn't the freedom Svetlana had imagined. She published a memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend, which became an international bestseller. She married an American architect, William Wesley Peters, in 1970 and had a daughter, Olga, but the marriage failed. She struggled with identity, with guilt, with the impossible weight of her name. In 1984, in a move that stunned everyone, Svetlana returned to the Soviet Union, claiming she wanted to see her children. The Soviet propaganda machine celebrated her return as proof that capitalism had failed her. But within 2 years, she left again, this time to England, then back to the United States. For the rest of her life, Svetlana wandered. She moved constantly: Wisconsin, California, England, back to Wisconsin. She changed her name to Lana Peters. She gave interviews denouncing her father, then stopped giving interviews entirely. She lived on the royalties from her books, but struggled financially. She was brilliant, articulate, and deeply, profoundly broken. Svetlana Aliyeva died on November 22, 2011, in a nursing home in Richland Center, Wisconsin. She was 85 years old. In her final years, she had been largely forgotten, a historical curiosity rather than a person. Her daughter Olga, born in America, grew up knowing she was Stalin's granddaughter, but tried to live a normal life far from that legacy. Svetlana's defection proved that even Stalin's own child couldn't escape the horror of what he'd done. She had chosen truth over loyalty, freedom over family, and spent the rest of her life paying the price. The grandchildren, carrying the name into the 21st century. Stalin's grandchildren and great-grandchildren are alive today, scattered across Russia, America, and Europe. Their responses to the Stalin legacy vary dramatically, some embracing it, others fleeing from it, and many simply trying to live normal lives while carrying an impossible surname. Yevgeny Djugashvili, Yakov's grandson, son of Yakov's daughter Gulia, became a prominent figure in Russia. Born in 1936, he grew up in the shadow of his grandfather's crimes and his father's abandonment. Remarkably, Yevgeny spent much of his later life defending Stalin's legacy, arguing that the dictator's crimes were exaggerated and that he was a great leader who saved Russia. He sued Russian media outlets for insulting his grandfather's memory and became a controversial figure in post-Soviet Russia. He died in 2016, unrepentant in his defense of Stalin. Alexander Bedonsky, Vasily's son, took a different path entirely. He changed his surname to distance himself from Stalin and lived a quiet life, rarely speaking publicly about his family connection. He became an artist and sculptor, channeling his inherited trauma into creative work rather than politics or public statements. Chris Evans, Svetlana's son from her final marriage, his birth name was Joseph, later changed, grew up in America, largely disconnected for his Soviet heritage. He became a successful entrepreneur and has given few interviews about his infamous great-grandfather. He represents the possibility of complete reinvention, an American life built far from Stalin's shadow. Olga Peters, Svetlana's daughter, has maintained the most private life of all Stalin's living descendants. She works as a fashion buyer and has deliberately avoided the media spotlight, understanding that her grandmother's fame brought mostly pain. These grandchildren faced an impossible choice: embrace the Stalin name and defend it, reject it and live in hiding, or attempt some middle path of acknowledgement without endorsement. There is no right answer when your grandfather murdered millions. The moral weight: can evil be inherited? The Stalin family's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about inherited guilt and family loyalty. Yakov died because his father valued ideology over blood. Vasily was destroyed by the privilege his name provided. Svetlana escaped but could never truly be free. The grandchildren carry a name that will forever mean terror, purges, and mass murder. But here's what makes this different from Nazi families. Stalin's relatives couldn't flee to Argentina, couldn't change their names and disappear, couldn't choose a different path while Stalin lived. They were prisoners of the Soviet system, trapped inside the machine their father built. When Svetlana finally escaped, she was nearly 40 years old. The descendants who defend Stalin's legacy, like Yevgeny Djugashvili, argued that acknowledging his crimes means admitting their entire family history is stained with blood. The descendants who flee, like those who change their names, understand that some legacies are too toxic to carry, and those who simply try to live quietly in the middle are perhaps the wisest, acknowledging the past without being defined by it. Conclusion: the dictator's shadow. Joseph Stalin died 71 years ago, but his shadow still haunts those who share his blood. Children destroyed by his cruelty, grandchildren defending or fleeing his memory, and great-grandchildren trying to live normal lives under the world's most infamous surname. The Stalin family proves that totalitarian power consumes everyone it touches, even, or especially, the tyrant's own children, and that some legacies are so toxic that escape becomes a multi-generational struggle with no clear resolution.